Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. Whispers beneath the floorboards. It was late, around midnight, when I first heard them. I had been tossing in bed, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the silence of the house. That's when the sound cut through the quiet, the familiar, heated murmur of my parents arguing downstairs. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. My heart stuttered in my chest. My parents were dead. They had died in a car crash a year ago. But the unmistakable cadence of their voices drifted up from the living room, just like it always had. My father's deep, gravelly tones clashed with my mother's sharp replies. I sat up, the wooden bed frame creaking beneath me, and strained to listen. Every word was muffled, unintelligible, but the rhythm of their argument was painfully familiar. My pulse quickened as memories flooded back. Their arguments had always been intense, leaving a lingering tension in the air, but nothing prepared me for hearing them now. I had been the one to identify their bodies at the morgue. The house had been eerily quiet ever since, until tonight. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, pulled me from the bed. I tiptoed across the floor, the boards cold under my bare feet. I paused at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing, trying to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps someone had broken in. Maybe it was the TV left on somehow, but I hadn't touched the old set in weeks. The voices continued below, steady, relentless, and then I heard my name, spoken sharply by my father. A chill spread through me. "Leah," he said, his voice laced with frustration, like I had interrupted them. But I hadn't moved, I hadn't said a word. I crouched at the top of the stairs, peering into the dimly lit hallway that led to the living room. There was nothing, no shadow or movement. Just the hum of those familiar voices. "Leah, are you coming down here?" My mother's voice now, shrill and demanding. My stomach twisted. They couldn't be real. They weren't real. I had to remind myself of this. But the pull to see them, to confront whatever this was, grew unbearable. I swallowed, forcing my feet to move, descending the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. As I reached the bottom step, the air changed. It felt thick, suffocating, like the walls were closing in. The voices had stopped abruptly, leaving only the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The living room was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the single lamp I always left on. But something was wrong. The air smelled different, musty, like damp earth and rotting wood. And then I noticed the floorboards in the center of the room. They were warped, bulging slightly, as if something beneath them was trying to push its way through. The warped floorboards in the center of the room seemed to pulse, like something alive was pressing against them. My breath caught in my throat, and for a long moment, I just stood there, unable to move. My heart was racing, but my body refused to respond. The voices had gone, but their presence lingered, an oppressive weight that bore down on me from all sides. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as they brushed the edge of the bulging wood. The air around the spot was colder, unnaturally so, and I could almost feel a faint vibration through the floor. I pulled back, my stomach churning with unease. This wasn't normal. None of this was. But then, when had anything been normal since the accident? Since the funeral? My mind raced, replaying the arguments that had haunted this house for years. The tension, the fights, the words that were never fully resolved. Were they trying to tell me something now? Was this their way of coming back, of finishing whatever had been left unsaid? I pushed the thought away, shaking my head. No, this was madness. I wasn't losing my grip. I couldn't be. I stood up quickly, backing away from the floorboards, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I turned to head back upstairs, a loud crack split the air, freezing me in place. The wood underfoot groaned, and when I looked down again, I saw it. The boards were shifting, widening. A long, thin crack ran along the floor, jagged and unnatural. As if something beneath was forcing it open, demanding to be let out. My throat tightened. No. No, this isn't real, I whispered to myself, but my voice sounded weak, distant. I needed to leave, to get out of the house, to run, but where could I go? This was my home, and there was nowhere else. Still, every instinct screamed at me to get away, yet my feet stayed rooted to the ground. Then, from within the crack, came a sound. Faint at first, like a low, guttural hum. It grew louder, rising into something almost like a voice, though not quite human. It spoke in hushed tones, indecipherable, yet it felt familiar. I stepped closer, against every ounce of reason, and knelt beside the widening gap. My hands shook as I leaned in, trying to make sense of the sound. And then I heard it clearly, a whisper. "Leah. Leah, it's cold here. So cold." It was my mother's voice, fragile and broken, like she was trapped beneath the floor. I gasped, my mind reeling as the crack continued to spread. Her voice grew faint, distant, as if she were being pulled further away. But before I could react, another voice joined hers, a low, growling snarl that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't my father. It wasn't anyone I knew. I scrambled back from the crack, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The growling voice had twisted something deep inside me, a primal fear that I couldn't shake. My mother's voice, fragile, pleading, was being consumed by it, drowned out by the low, guttural sounds rising from beneath the floor. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. There was nowhere to go, and a part of me, some horrible, twisted part, needed to know what was underneath. The crack in the floor widened, jagged splinters peeling back as though the house itself was ripping open. The cold air seeped up through the widening gap, and the musty, rotting smell intensified. It was the stench of decay, of something old and forgotten, buried for too long. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and every instinct screamed at me to get out. But I couldn't leave. Not now. Not when they were so close. "Leah," the voice of my mother called again, faint, almost drowned out by the sinister growl that echoed from the depths. "Please, help me. I'm so cold." My throat tightened, and I felt tears prickling at my eyes. This couldn't be real. She was dead, they were dead. But the pain in her voice, the desperation, felt too real to ignore. Against my better judgment, I crawled closer to the gap, peering down into the darkness beneath the floorboards. It was black, a void that swallowed everything. But I could see something moving, shifting, just below the surface. Shadows. Or worse. As I leaned in, the cold intensified, sinking into my bones. And then, from the darkness, two pale hands reached up. They were thin, skeletal, the skin stretched tight over the bones, mottled with bruises. I gasped and stumbled back, but the hands didn't stop. They clawed at the edges of the floor, pulling something up, something I didn't want to see. It was my mother, or something that looked like her. Her face was gone, hollowed out, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. Her lips were cracked, and her once warm brown eyes were clouded over, lifeless. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as though she was trying to speak, but no words came out. Only a faint, rasping breath. Behind her, in the darkness, the growling voice returned, louder now, closer. I tried to stand, my legs wobbling beneath me. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice shaking. But this thing that looked like my mother only stared, unblinking, her bony hands still clutching the edges of the crack. And then she spoke, in a voice that wasn't hers. "You let us die," she hissed, her voice deep and distorted, like something else was speaking through her. "Now it's your turn, Leah." Before I could react, a shadow surged up from behind her, massive and formless, with glowing eyes like burning coals. It reached out, its long, clawed fingers stretching toward me. My scream caught in my throat as I scrambled backward, but the shadow loomed closer, consuming the room in darkness. The darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't see anything, couldn't feel anything but the oppressive cold, sinking into my skin, deeper and deeper. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, each one more shallow than the last. The shadow loomed above me, those fiery eyes burning like twin stars in the void. My mother's twisted form still clung to the edges of the crack, her head jerking unnaturally as she watched, expressionless. I couldn't move. I was trapped. The growling intensified, shaking the very walls of the house. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It was in my head, rattling my thoughts, filling every crevice of my mind. "You let us die. You let us die." My mother's voice echoed, warping into a chorus of accusations, each one heavier than the last. "Please," I whimpered, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping, praying, that this was all some terrible dream. But when I opened my eyes again, it was still there, the shadow, the monster, reaching for me. Its fingers, long and bony, grazed my arm, and the touch sent a jolt of icy pain through my body. I pushed myself back against the wall, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst. I didn't mean to. The words tumbled out of me, frantic, as though I could bargain with this thing, this creature that had once been my mother. But it was no use. It knew the truth. I knew the truth. I hadn't been there for them. I had stayed home that night, angry, refusing to answer my mother's calls. If I had picked up, if I had spoken to her, maybe they would have stayed, maybe they wouldn't have been on that road when the truck hit them. The guilt, the weight of it, crushed me. The shadow seemed to sense it, seemed to feed on it. Its grin widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that glistened in the dark. I could feel it drawing closer, suffocating me with its presence. And then, just when I thought I would lose myself to the darkness, I heard something, a sound from upstairs. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the halls. I froze, my mind racing. Was it another trick? Another hallucination? But the sound was too real, too distinct. Someone, or something, was walking toward me. The shadow hesitated, its burning eyes shifting upward toward the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever was coming. It was stronger than the shadow, stronger than whatever had taken hold of this house. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the air seemed to hum with a strange energy. I turned, desperate to see what was approaching. And then, I saw it, a figure at the top of the stairs, tall, shrouded in darkness but unmistakably human. The figure began to descend, slowly, methodically, one step at a time. As it reached the bottom of the stairs, the light from the living room flickered for just a moment, revealing a face. It was my father. Or what was left of him. His eyes were dark pits, his skin pale and stretched thin, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. He looked right at me, but his gaze seemed to pierce through me, as though I wasn't even there. "Leah," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. "We're not alone anymore." Behind him, more shadows began to spill out of the walls, crawling across the floor like living tendrils of darkness. They slithered toward me, their whispers filling the air with promises of things I didn't want to hear, things I couldn't bear. I pressed myself against the wall, my body shaking, as the shadows closed in, and my father's smile grew wider, stretching unnaturally across his face. Then the floorboards beneath me gave way, collapsing into the darkness below. I fell, the air rushing past me as the shadows reached out, their cold fingers grabbing hold of me. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. And as I tumbled into the abyss, their voices followed. My parents, the shadows, all of them whispering the same thing, over and over. "Now you're one of us. Hey. Subscribe for more true scary stories." Story 2. The Haunting Lullaby. I had forgotten about the old piano. It had been years since anyone played it. Locked away in the attic, draped in dusty sheets, it was a relic of my grandmother's past, a past she had never talked about. That song, though. That lullaby. The soft, lilting melody she used to hum as she rocked me to sleep still lingered in the corners of my mind. I hadn't thought of it in years, but when I returned to the house after her passing, I heard it again. It began the night I moved back in, the house eerily quiet except for the creaks and groans of old wood settling. I was sitting in the living room, unpacking a box of memories, when the faintest note reached my ears. A single key struck, hesitant, like a whisper, and then another, forming the familiar tune. My chest tightened as the melody unraveled, drawing me toward the attic stairs. As I climbed, each step groaned beneath my weight, as though the house itself resisted my approach. The air was colder up here, sharper, and I could feel a prickling sensation creeping over my skin. The attic door loomed at the top of the stairs, slightly ajar. Light seeped through the crack, flickering faintly, though I had never turned on the light up there. Pushing the door open with trembling hands, I stepped inside. The piano sat in the far corner, untouched, draped in a thick layer of dust. The keys were still, but the song continued to drift through the air, hanging in the silence between heartbeats. It was unmistakable, my grandmother's lullaby, each note perfectly clear. Yet no one was playing. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat, as the temperature in the room plummeted. I could feel eyes on me, watchful, expectant. The kind of presence that made your skin crawl. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure by the piano, just out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing but shadows. The song faded, leaving the room unnervingly quiet, the only sound my ragged breathing. What the hell is going on? I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. But deep down, I already knew. There was something wrong with that piano. Something tied to it. And to her. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to convince myself that the piano playing on its own had been some kind of vivid hallucination. After all, grief does strange things to people, and my grandmother's death still hung heavy on me. But as much as I wanted to forget, the song kept replaying in my mind, note for note, just as she used to sing it. Determined to put it out of my head, I went about my day, sorting through old boxes in the attic. Most were filled with moth-eaten clothes and outdated knickknacks, things my grandmother had hoarded over the years. But as I pushed aside a stack of yellowed books, I found a wooden chest hidden beneath a pile of fabric. It was small, unremarkable, but when I touched it, a chill ran through my fingers. Inside, I found a collection of sheet music, each page carefully folded and worn at the edges. They were all variations of the same song, the lullaby. But these versions were different, darker, with strange, dissonant chords that twisted the melody into something almost sinister. My heart raced as I flipped through the pages, noticing odd scribbles in the margins. Strange symbols and words written in a language I didn't recognize. Among the sheet music was a photograph of my grandmother, much younger, standing next to a man I had never seen before. They were posed in front of the same piano, her hand resting on the keys. The man's face was blurred, as though the picture had been deliberately scratched. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Something about the man unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. My grandmother had never mentioned him. "Who are you?" I muttered, staring at the photo. As if in response, the piano rang out again, a soft note followed by another, and then the lullaby began to play. The melody was clearer now, filling the entire attic with its haunting sound. I backed away from the chest, the air thickening around me, making it hard to breathe. I ran down the stairs, but the music followed, echoing through the halls. I slammed the attic door shut, heart pounding, and leaned against it. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp, jarring sound in the otherwise eerie silence. It was a message from my mother. "Stay away from the piano," it read. My stomach dropped. I hadn't told her anything about the piano. In fact, we hadn't spoken in weeks. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I dialed her number, and after a few rings, her voice came through, but it wasn't her usual calm tone. "Don't go near it, do you hear me?" she said, panic lacing her words. "It's not just an old piano. It's something else. Something dangerous." Before I could respond, the line went dead, leaving only the faint sound of the lullaby echoing in the distance. I stared at my phone, the screen dark, my heart pounding in my chest. My mother's warning echoed in my mind, and the more I tried to rationalize it, the more the fear tightened its grip on me. What had she meant by dangerous? My grandmother had never been the type to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. At least, that's what I thought. But now, with the piano playing by itself and that strange photograph, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something dark hidden in our family's past. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like the start of the lullaby again, pulling at my sanity. Around 3 a.m., I finally gave in. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way back to the attic, determined to find answers. If the piano was tied to something sinister, I needed to know what. I needed to understand why it had started again, why it wouldn't leave me alone. The attic was as cold and dark as before, and the air felt thick with something unspoken, as if the walls themselves held secrets. I approached the piano slowly, its presence looming in the corner like a dark sentinel. The chest was still there, its contents scattered from my earlier search. I picked up the photograph again, examining the blurred man more closely. There was something about him, the way he stood, something familiar, yet deeply unsettling. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. The room plunged into darkness, and in the silence that followed, the piano struck a single, deep note. I jumped back, the flashlight clattering to the floor. Then, out of the darkness, I heard a voice, a whisper so faint it could have been the wind. "He's coming." I froze. My throat went dry, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was unmistakable, it was my grandmother's. But she was dead. I scrambled for the flashlight, my hands shaking. When the beam flickered back to life, it illuminated something new in the photograph. The man's face was no longer blurred. His eyes were fixed directly on me, cold and hollow, and his mouth was twisted into a grin that chilled me to the bone. I dropped the photograph, backing away. That's when I saw it. In the dim light, a shadow shifted behind the piano, moving in the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape seemed wrong, like it didn't quite belong in this world. My breath caught as the figure moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its form distorting as it stepped into the weak beam of light. It was the man from the photograph. His face was even more horrifying in person, sunken, his skin stretched tight over his skull. His eyes, dark and endless, locked onto mine. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could hear was the lullaby, now louder than ever, drowning out my thoughts, pulling me into its dark, twisted melody. The figure reached out, his hand cold and skeletal, inches from my face. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished. The music stopped, and the attic was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, the photograph still lying at my feet, the man's face grinning up at me. I didn't leave the attic that night. I couldn't. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, useless and paralyzed beneath me as I sat there in the cold, clutching the flashlight like it was my only lifeline. The photograph, with its grinning figure, remained face up on the floor, a reminder that what I had seen was real. I knew the man from the photograph wasn't done with me. He was waiting, lurking just beyond the shadows. Morning light crept through the attic windows, thin and gray, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Hours passed in silence, my mind racing. Who was the man? Why had my grandmother kept his picture? And why had my mother warned me so late? I had no choice but to confront her, to ask the questions I'd been avoiding. When I finally found the courage to leave the attic, my phone was still dead from the night before. I rushed downstairs, plugged it in, and waited impatiently for it to charge enough to call her. As soon as the screen flickered to life, I dialed her number, my fingers trembling. The call rang once, then twice before she picked up, her voice distant and shaky. "Mom," I breathed, I saw him. The man in the photo. There was a long pause, the kind that swallows everything whole. Then she whispered, "You weren't supposed to. He was never meant for you." Her words were like ice, cutting through the air. "What are you talking about? Who is he?" "Your grandmother. She made a deal. A long time ago. Before you were born. The lullaby. It was the price she paid." Her voice cracked, breaking with years of buried fear. "She summoned him to protect us, but something went wrong. He never left. He stayed, watching. Waiting." My blood ran cold. The man, no, the thing I had seen, wasn't just some ghost. It was something much worse. A demon. "Why didn't you tell me?" I shouted, anger and panic surging through me. "Why didn't anyone warn me?" "Because the deal was meant to end with her," my mother sobbed. "She was supposed to be the last. But the piano, it called him back. The song is his link to our world. You have to destroy it. The piano. Of course. It was the key. The thing tethering him to me." Without thinking, I ran back up to the attic, fueled by desperation. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew heavy again, thick with his presence. The piano loomed in the corner, the familiar notes of the lullaby already starting to fill the room. I grabbed a nearby hammer, my hands shaking as I approached the piano. "It ends now," I whispered, raising the hammer above my head. But before I could bring it down, The room plunged into darkness. The piano roared to life, the keys slamming down in a violent cacophony as the melody warped into something twisted and nightmarish. The walls seemed to close in around me, and out of the shadows, the man emerged once more, his grin wider, more grotesque than before. "You can't stop it," he hissed, his voice low and guttural. "It's too late." His cold fingers wrapped around my wrist, and I screamed, dropping the hammer. The piano's song grew louder, reverberating through my bones, drowning out my thoughts. I could feel myself slipping, losing control. But then, through the haze of fear, my grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. "It's not the piano. It's the song." With a sudden burst of clarity, I turned to the sheet music, grabbing it off the stand. I tore at the pages, ripping them apart, scattering them across the floor. The lullaby faltered, the notes stumbling, growing weaker. The man's grip loosened, his form flickering like a dying flame. "No!" he howled, his voice distorting, the sound tearing through the room as he began to fade. His eyes locked onto mine one last time, burning with hatred. "You haven't won. The song. It never truly ends." And with that, he was gone, vanished into the darkness. The piano was silent. The house, still. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible. The lullaby. Playing once again. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3. The Uninvited. Moving into the old house on Sycamore Lane felt like stepping back in time. The floors creaked with every step, the walls groaned with secrets, and the air seemed to hold the weight of the years. It wasn't exactly what I imagined when we first started house hunting, but with the market being as insane as it was, we didn't have many choices. At least, that's what I told myself. Still, the pet door unnerved me. "We don't even have a dog," I muttered as I crouched to inspect the small, weathered flap in the back door. It hung loosely, as though something had used it recently. My wife, Sarah, laughed from across the room, busy unpacking boxes. "Maybe it's an invitation to get one," she teased, but I wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about it, how it swayed, just barely, even though there was no breeze. We had already checked the yard, no holes, no burrows. But that night, the first night, I heard something. It started around 2 a.m., a faint shuffling noise that seemed to come from the kitchen. I sat up in bed, heart racing, training to hear it again. The sound was unmistakable, like nails scraping softly against the wood floor. I nudged Sarah, but she slept soundly beside me, oblivious to the strange noises. Quietly, I crept out of bed, the house eerily still as I made my way down the hallway. The kitchen was empty, or so it seemed. I flicked on the light, casting harsh shadows across the room, and immediately felt a chill sweep through me. The pet door? It was swaying back and forth, gently tapping against the frame. But more alarming was the trail of wet prints leading from the door into the kitchen. They weren't paw prints, though. They were small, human-like, but distorted, as if whoever, or whatever, had left them wasn't walking on full feet. I swallowed hard and followed the trail, my pulse pounding in my ears. It led to the pantry door. Slowly, I reached out, fingers trembling, and opened it. Nothing. The shelves were lined with cans and dry goods, all neatly arranged just as we had left them. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there just moments before. Something had come through that door. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those wet, misshapen footprints circling my bed, something unseen hovering just out of sight. By morning, the prints were gone, but the memory of them lingered like a stain in my mind. The next night, I couldn't stop thinking about the pet door. Every time I passed it, I felt an irrational urge to board it up, to block whatever had come in the night before. But Sarah insisted I was overreacting. She didn't hear the sounds, didn't see the prints. As far as she was concerned, it was an old house, old houses made noise. Maybe it had been a draft. But drafts didn't leave footprints. "You need to relax, Tom. It's probably just your nerves. We've had a stressful move," Sarah said over breakfast, sipping her coffee without a care in the world. She kissed me on the cheek before heading out to work, her footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. Left alone, I stood in the kitchen. staring at the pet door as it gently flapped in the windless morning. I couldn't take my eyes off it. What was it that had come inside? And, more importantly, why? By late afternoon, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed my toolbox from the garage and, without telling Sarah, hammered a few nails into the frame to seal it shut. A temporary fix, I thought. Just until I could figure out what was going on. But as I hammered the last nail in, a chill crawled up my spine. For a moment, I felt as though I were being watched. That night, Sarah and I went to bed as usual, but I couldn't sleep. Every little creak and groan of the house kept me on edge. My ears strained for the sound, the shuffling, the scratching, the faint presence that had haunted me the night before. And then, just as I began to drift into an uneasy sleep, I heard it again. The shuffling was louder this time, more insistent. My eyes shot open, and I glanced at the clock, 3:04 a.m. Slowly, I got out of bed, heart pounding. I moved down the hallway, keeping my steps light, barely breathing. When I reached the kitchen, the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The pet door? It had been torn open. The nails I'd hammered in were bent and twisted, as though something on the other side had forced its way in. The door itself hung limply, a ragged flap barely attached to the frame. The same wet prints, those same grotesque, human-like prints, stretched across the floor, but this time they didn't lead to the pantry. They led to the stairs. To our bedroom. I froze, a surge of panic gripping me as I realized whatever had come through that door was now upstairs. With Sarah. Without thinking, I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a kitchen knife, and bolted back up the stairs. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the bedroom and flung open the door. The room was dark, the curtains swaying gently in the night air. Sarah was still asleep, peaceful and undisturbed, but the door to our closet stood slightly ajar. The footprints ended there, just outside the door. My hands trembled as I approached, the knife clenched tightly in my fist. I yanked the closet door open, but inside, there was only silence. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy. I shone my phone's light into the corners, expecting to find something crouched there in the shadows. But there was nothing. Only my own shallow breathing echoing back at me. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? I wasn't sure anymore. But one thing was clear, the pet door wasn't just an oddity. It was an entryway for something. Something that didn't belong. The next morning, I told Sarah everything. The footprints, the sounds in the night, the pet door breaking open despite my best efforts to seal it shut. She listened with a furrowed brow, her skepticism slowly fading into concern. I didn't want to scare you, I began, rubbing the back of my neck, but something's coming into this house every night. I don't know what it is, but it isn't normal. Sarah's face paled. What do you mean something's coming in? Like an animal? I shook my head. No, not an animal. At least, not any animal I've ever seen. I hesitated, my mind flashing back to those distorted footprints. It's like a person. But wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across her face. We should call someone, get the house checked out, she said, though her voice wavered with doubt. I could tell she was trying to rationalize everything, to find a reasonable explanation. But reason had no place here, not after what I had seen. That evening, we barricaded the back door with furniture. I even wedged a chair beneath the knob to make sure it couldn't open. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was using that door didn't need a way in, it had already found one. The hours dragged on, the house eerily silent except for the occasional creak of the old wood. By midnight, the tension was unbearable. Sarah lay beside me, wide awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as though listening for something. The quiet was worse than the noise. It felt like the calm before a storm. And then, around 2 a.m., the storm arrived. A loud thud reverberated through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of scratching. Not the light shuffling I'd heard before. This was frantic, desperate. Whatever it was, it wanted in. I bolted upright, heart hammering, as Sarah gripped my arm. "Tom," she whispered, voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" The scratching grew louder, more intense. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the bedside table, the same one I had kept there after the night before, and gestured for Sarah to stay put. But she didn't want to be left alone. Together, we crept down the stairs, each step bringing us closer to the source of the noise. When we reached the kitchen, the scene before us was horrifying. The barricade we had made, chairs, a small table, everything, had been pushed aside. The pet door, though nailed down and sealed, was shredded, the wood splintered and torn like paper. Something had come through. And then I saw it. A shadow, hunched and unnatural, moved slowly from the corner of the kitchen. It was crouched low to the ground, its limbs long and bent at angles that defied reason. It turned toward us, and though the light was dim, I saw its eyes, glowing faintly, inhumanly, from within a gaunt, twisted face. Sarah gasped, her hand covering her mouth. My own breath caught in my throat as the creature took a step closer. Its feet, no, its hands, left those same wet, distorted prints on the floor. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It let out a low, guttural growl, a sound so primal it made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I lunged forward with the knife, desperate to defend us, but the creature was fast, inhumanly fast. It darted back into the shadows, disappearing beneath the stairs. My heart pounded as we backed away, but the creature didn't pursue us. It remained hidden in the darkness, watching. Sarah, I whispered, barely able to form words. We have to get out. Now. But before we could make a move, there was a loud crash from below, beneath the floorboards. A deep, resonant thudding, like something massive was clawing its way up from the earth itself. The pet door was just the beginning. Whatever had come into our house wasn't alone. The thudding from below grew louder, each hit vibrating through the floor, rattling the windows. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. What's happening? What's under us, Tom? I had no answer. My mind raced as the sounds intensified, a steady, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from deep beneath the house. The creature we'd seen was still there, lurking in the shadows beneath the stairs, but it no longer moved. It seemed almost waiting, as if anticipating what was coming. Without thinking, I dragged Sarah toward the front door, but just as my hand reached the knob, the thudding stopped. A silence fell over the house, thick and suffocating. For a moment, I dared to hope it was over, that maybe whatever had come into our home had gone. But then, in the stillness, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was coming from the basement. No, Sarah whispered, backing away. No, we're not going down there, Tom. We're leaving. We need to leave now. I know, I said, pulling her toward the door again. But before we could take another step, the floor beneath us buckled, and a crack split through the wood, snaking its way from the living room all the way to the back of the house. The walls groaned, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something rotten. From the crack in the floor, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep up, pooling across the wood. It smelled foul, like decay, and I could see faint movement within it, tiny, writhing shapes just below the surface. My stomach turned, and I had to fight the urge to retch. But worse than the liquid was the sound that followed, the unmistakable, sickening sound of something crawling up through the gap. Without warning, the pet door, what remained of it, was flung open with a force that sent the remaining wood splinters flying across the room. Something large, much larger than the creature under the stairs, squeezed its way through the tiny doorframe, distorting itself in ways that defied logic. I backed up, pulling Sarah with me, as the thing unfolded itself in our kitchen. It was massive, taller than the ceiling should have allowed, its skin pale and stretched tight across a skeletal frame. Its head was grotesque, elongated with wide, lidless eyes that glowed the same eerie light as the smaller creature. But this one was far worse. It was hungry. I could feel its hunger in the air, the way its gaze locked onto us, and the low, guttural noise that reverberated from deep within its chest. Run, I whispered, pushing Sarah toward the front door. Go. Now. She didn't argue. We ran, but the thing was faster. As soon as we reached the door, it crashed into the walls with a force that shook the entire house. The sound of splintering wood and crashing furniture filled the air as it pursued us, dragging its elongated limbs through the narrow spaces of the hallway. But before it could reach us, the floor beneath it gave way. With a deafening crack, the creature fell through, disappearing into the gaping hole beneath the house. The thudding resumed, louder now, as if whatever was below was calling it back. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I pulled Sarah outside, slamming the front door behind us. We ran across the lawn, into the street, breathless and terrified. But even from there, we could see it, the thing inside the house wasn't gone. Its pale, twisted hands clawed their way back up from the hole, dragging its grotesque body behind it. The house shuddered, creaking as if it were alive, trying to contain the nightmare inside. But I knew it wouldn't hold for long. And then I realized, this wasn't just our house. Whatever we had let in, it was spreading. Behind us, the neighbors' lights began to flicker, their own homes creaking and groaning in the night. The pet door was just the start. The ground beneath us was shifting, breaking open, letting something through. Something that wouldn't stop. As we stood there, frozen in terror, I heard it again, the faint whisper, carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from inside the house this time. It was coming from beneath us. The earth rumbled, and I knew the worst had yet to come. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.